Hello, everyone, and this is episode 55 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, we'll be talking about the interplay between history and folklore. But before we do that, I just want to thank all of our supporters on Patreon. We have now met our second goal, which is to establish a full paid SoundCloud account. So keep an eye on that, as I will be adding our entire back catalog. I'll probably be starting from those recent episodes and working back. So you can probably see that happening today if you keep an eye on it. It does take some time to get those uploaded because they're large files, and SoundCloud likes to do a lot of processing and thinking about things before they post it. But thank you again to all of you who are supporters of the podcast and, of course, of Ask Historians in general. So hopefully you're getting as much bang for your buck as I am. As for today's topic, we will be talking about history and folklore as separate academic professions, but also two fields of study that really kind of build upon each other and interplay with each other, even as they might somehow, ask different questions and have different aims about what they want to get from the past. Kind of our running central theme through here will be the kind of, foundation, the solid practical foundation we're going to be based on, is looking at legends and folktales from Cornwall, particularly that of the called the Knockers in Cornwall, but also when those Cornish people migrated to the Americas, leaving behind their harsh mining lives in Cornwall to take up harsh mining lives in Nevada, they became the Tommyknockers out west. So that'll be something, a theme that we kind of circle around, even as we kind of very, very much diverge off in other topics and other legend, other myths, and really even talking about what is a myth or what is a folktale, what is a legend, and looking at the development of the field of folklore by looking at our guest's own kind of, as he puts it, his academic pedigree, which is pretty prestigious. So I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I'm here with Ronald James. He's a retired Nevada State Historic Preservation Officer. He administered that agency for almost 30 years, served on the National Park System Advisory Board, and as the chairman of the National Historic Landmarks Committee. He's the author or co-author of 13 books, including The Roar and the Silence, A History of Virginia City, and The Comstock Lode, and has published roughly 36 articles appearing in 6 different countries dealing with history, folklore, archaeology, architectural history. He is a historian and a folklorist with degrees in both fields from the University of Nevada, Reno, where he also lectured for over 3 decades. He was the nation's ITT Fellow to Ireland in 1981-82, studying folklore at their national archives. And in 2014, he was inducted into the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame. In 2015, he became affiliated with the anthropology department at Iowa State University. And in between all of those accolades, he spends a little bit of time on Ask Historians as It's All Folklore, answering questions in that area. Ron, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I would just want to ask you, because this is something you've been doing for a long time, what got you started on looking at folklore, and particularly the folklore that you look at, which is kind of mainly in kind of the American West, but also looking at a lot of kind of the distribution of European folk tales into the West through migration?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I started off very interested actually in Upper Paleolithic cultures in Europe, and kind of marched through time as I started my undergraduate career. And it seems like every year I came forward a millennium, and picked up a second degree in history as I went, and but still was very much committed to Europe. The folklore was really quite accidental. I was interested in belief systems and in pre-conversion religion. Then met Sven Liljeblad, who became my mentor, who himself had an outstanding career in Europe, but was chased out by Hitler. He had operated in an underground, getting Marxists and Jews out of Germany, operating out of Copenhagen. And so with the declaration of war in 1939, he was a marked man, and he needed to flee, so he ended up coming to the United States. And just by chance, I ended up being his only and last student for 5 years. And that turned me into a folklorist. I ended up between fields. which is really a tough place to be in a lot of ways academically. Fields always say that they're interested in interdisciplinary activity, but the practitioners of those aren't always regarded as they're always thought of as belonging to the other field, not to their own field. My employment was also accidental. I became the administrator of the Historic Preservation Office, and that thrust upon me an American field. And I ended up just in really finding a lot of enjoyment in that. And with studies of immigration, started looking at European people and Asians and who came to the American West and with their own belief systems, and always tried to integrate folklore into even the historical analysis of those Western peoples then.
No, you mentioned Sven Lilleblad. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but probably not. And I apologize to everyone who speaks more Swedish than I do.
He was a very nice fellow, and he'd be delighted to have you call him anything.
So he trained underneath another very famous folklorist, someone who, in my background research for this, it seems like almost created the field of academic folklore studies, and that's von Sydow, Carl von Sydow, I believe.
Right. He pronounced it von Sydow. His son is the famous actor Max von Sydow, as Americans call him, who's been in hundreds of films, and including The Greatest Story Ever Told. And but his father, Sven's mentor, Carl Wilhelm von Sydow, was really one of the great pivotal folklorists of the history of the field, especially in Europe. He turned what had been a focus on collecting and on looking for the ancient forms of a folk tale that was part of the inspiration that gave us the Brothers Grimm, and he turned that into a real academic discipline and made it into the modern science that it is today.
So the focus then was on kind of like tracing back, saying, if we have this tale here that's similar to this tale over here, and then if we trace back further and further back through time, eventually you get to the first person, who told the tale, I guess you could say.
That's right, and it was very much a historical analysis, and the Finns developed even before von Sydow what was called the Finnish historic geographic method, which was an effort to trace the history of folk tales and by implication also legends, a different type of story, by looking at the distribution of the variants and regarding those stories as historically genetically linked. So if you're able to follow their distribution geographically, then you can understand something of their history, also complemented by looking at primary records that would refer to those stories. They often use the analogy of a stone dropped into a pool of calm water, and the largest of the rings produced by that incident would also be the oldest. And the line of thought was that if a folk tale started in the Middle East and 3,000 years ago, presumably, or whatever, that as it reached someplace like Norway or Finland, you might be looking at the oldest form, where the newer forms would be in the Middle East or in Greece or in Italy.
Yeah, and von Sydow, he came up with, because if you're going to be taken seriously as an academic, you need to come up with your own terminology for things. He came up with a great deal of ways of kind of classifying and looking at these things. And I like the fact that you brought up this idea of not just the ripples effects and the ripple going out, but also kind of a genetic relatedness, which of course is not necessarily, if you go down to the exact term of the word, it's not necessarily a biological thing, but that's how most people think of it. And, looking at this, it seemed like there was kind of this almost an ecological approach to it. And I know that von Sydow came up with this idea of oikotypes or ecotypes that kind of influence the development of myths, and also that you can have these central and these peripheral regions, and those are all kind of very familiar ideas if you've kind of studied biological evolution.
Yeah, von Sydow in this regard was kind of old school. He was born in 1878. He had a well-established career in traditional folklore studies. It was largely because of his graduate students, and in this case, because of Sven Lilleblad, who was born in 1899 and took his bachelor's in 24 in social studies, because at that point you had to learn everything about the humanities in order to have a degree. He went on and did his PhD in 27 under the direction of von Südhof, and he was the vanguard of the archetype school under von Südhof's direction. So he became the guinea pig, and his dissertation, which interestingly enough was on the Grateful Dead, which is a collection of motifs, looked at how the folktale, not interested so much in trying to find this magical ancient Ur form, but rather just simply to look at a group of folktales that had the Grateful Dead motif as it diffused over space, and to see how it was affected by what they regarded as culture barriers or culture zones. And they used the analogy of the botanical form of an ecotype, which is that as a plant diffuses from one area to another, its form can change, so that in particularly lush lowlands area, a plant might really be huge and with big flowers, but as it goes into a more mountainous, dry region, the flowers and the plant may diminish in size and be altered by the environment. And that was what they were looking at, was how various culture zones affected the way a story would manifest as it diffused. And in this, they were looking at a group of stories, especially were how they would be affected by these various culture zones.
Well, I think we've been dancing a little bit around some kind of an elephant in the room, which is what necessarily is a folktale? What distinguishes it from other ways people communicate? What, to take a kind of a functionalist approach to it, what is the purpose of a folktale?
Of course, there's all these terms, and we like to think of them as being absolute, but then the actual people who tell the stories don't behave themselves. They don't use their dictionary properly, and so the terms get kind of muddled as we go. But folklorists talk about a folktale, which is the long, multi-episodic novel of the folk. That is a story that was not intended to be believed, but was told strictly for entertainment purposes. And so on a functional level, the folktale was really designed just to simply entertain. That's regarded in antithesis to the legend, which if the folk would just behave themselves and use the terms the way we use them, and we would all understand that a legend was in fact a shorter story told to provide a warning about something. It was meant to be believed, and it often had a bad ending as opposed to the folktale with its famous happily ever after ending. The legend often ended horribly. It was told to warn people, so it also had this function of just telling people how to behave properly in the world. The world surrounded by the supernatural, and supernatural that had to be treated with due caution, or else you'd suffer the consequences. So these legends would explain to people how they should behave in a treacherous world. So that was its own function. But that's not to say that the legends weren't often entertaining as well.
Bringing up this idea about teaching people the way to behave, but also entertaining them. One thing I noticed looking at this is that these things are constantly changing and evolving and kind of filling and contracting and diffusing and diluting and intensifying to meet the needs and the demands of the people at the time. And I read one of your papers on Tommyknockers in Cornish folklore, and one of the things that struck me is that this idea of Tommyknockers, these underground tappings, was a story you would tell to children to entertain them, but it also kind of shunted them aside from asking any further questions, because sometimes those tappings in the night could be kind of illegal mining operations.
Well, that's the way it became, and it was interesting that at that point, to use a term that von Südhof crafted, which is a fict, something that was told to the children to be believed, but parents did not. We think of Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, but in this case, in California, high-grade miners, the miners who had stolen gold ore from the mines, would hammer them out in their basements. And when the children said, "What's that noise I heard last night when I was trying to sleep?" they would say, "Oh, that's a Tommyknocker underneath the house. So, don't ask questions because the Tommyknocker will get you if you get too inquisitive." And so that would be an example of a fic. But the knockers of Cornwall, and they became the Tommyknockers of the United States when they were an active tradition, not just reduced to this kind of post-world fixed status. The knockers were terrifying, and they had their own role in the mines. And part of that was to keep the miners on their toes and listening for clues that the knockers might provide. In other words, listening to the timbers. If you're going to stay alive underground, you want to make sure that you listen to all the subtle cues that might anticipate a cave-in. And the knocking, if it took a different form, might indicate that timbers were about to collapse, and so you got out. And the knocker had, in fact, warned you because you were an upstanding, fine fellow, and you had treated them with respect. The knockers, in turn, warned you when the mine was about to collapse and saved your life.
Yeah, this idea of using this kind of folk mythology to explain the unexplainable, to kind of give you an idea of controllability over the world. If a mine collapses and people die, then that's something that can happen. You can have no control over. But if you can say, well, you offended the knockers in some way, and therefore by offending them, that's retribution. It seems like it seems like these folktales make the world a more orderly place.
Yeah, I mean, the world is terrifying enough for an atheist. It's a pretty terrible place when you think about it. The natural disasters that can happen, or life is fragile, and you think you've got a career, and then all of a sudden you contract a disease, or a part of your body starts failing, and it really raises the angst. And I think a lot of politicians sometimes play into that kind of angst and try to be the soothing component that will allow people to calm down. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. And as long as you have a voice telling you this is how you can order the world, and you can be in control of it if you just follow these rules, there's a certain comfort to that, even if from the outside we look at it and realize the rules were kind of silly. In the case of listening to the timbers groaning and knocking, it may actually be a real reasonable, valuable tool. It may be ascribed to a Tommyknocker, but whatever it takes to make the miner pay special attention to those sounds, and whether it's a realistic scientific explanation or it's a supernatural explanation, the supernatural one might take you a lot further. It might enhance your focus.
Yeah, it does seem that, so much as we think of folktales as kind of irrational things, it seems like they really do reflect these very, very rational concerns, and even if expressing it through a very kind of magical way. And I think another incident to this is kind of something you've alluded to, is that people would ascribe illnesses or injuries to knockers as well, correct?
Well, yeah, or to some other supernatural entity. I mean, we often suggest, and I think there's some merit to it, that the idea of stroke, to have a stroke, which is a sudden disability. One day one moment you're fine, and the next moment you can't operate the left side of your body. That's an elfin stroke. An elfin dart has been sunk into you. So the supernatural is a treacherous place. You have to be real careful about it as far as the folk are concerned, and any kind of rules or guidelines that can be offered are extremely valuable, because where we, a perfectly rational, if that's what we are, modern person can look at the world and realize that it's a scary place. Imagine if you saw the world in a pre-industrial setting, cloaked with all sorts of supernatural forces that were whimsical and extremely dangerous. You want a rule book to be able to navigate your way through all that.
Now, you had mentioned an elvish dart, and that brings me to kind of another idea of von Sydow, which is this idea of periphery regions. And I'm probably going to be cramming a whole lot of my own ideas in here, but the idea of Cornwall, which is kind of the area we're talking about right now, as a periphery region. In other words, why don't I let you explain that instead of me doing
Well,
it?
yeah, there have been a number of observations about that from a number of places, Iceland in particular, but I think it applies to Cornwall, which is this remote peninsula, which is that as folklore diffuses, and especially as it reaches a remote area, it can mutate in a way. While we may not, I think for the most part, folklorists have given up on this magical Romantic era concept of the Ur form. Thousands of years ago, this story or this idea started. Instead, we can really look at it in more intimate terms historically, which is that when did this folk tale or when did this legend or motif diffuse to this remote area? And when it did, how did it change? And it's a process. It's a historical process of diffusion and change. When we see that when stories diffuse to Iceland, which has been very well thoroughly documented, and into Cornwall, which I'm in the process of trying to document myself, that stories often left off components because maybe they only arrived in one story form, and maybe it was a little different, and without the greater body of storytellers to help correct the story, it took a different form in these peripheral remote areas.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to kind of tie that back around to, this idea of elves is also the idea that when those stories do enter into a new region, it seems like they kind of blend and meld in with kind of pre-existing beliefs in the supernatural as well, or even tying back to kind of semi-remembered historical events. The idea of like, well, the knockers, are elves, or they are the spirits of old Romans, or of old Hebrew or Jewish people who are trapped beneath the earth. Is that something that?
Yeah.
Hmm?
No, go ahead. Yeah. The Jews were. Yeah, they. Some one of the ideas was that the knockers were Jews who were being punished for the crucifixion, so they were sent to the mines of Cornwall.
Yeah, which is kind of a remarkable collusion of a number of different, at least at the very least of theological ways of kind of taking this kind of folk mythology, folklore of spirits and things underneath the ground, and tying it into this greater kind of medieval Christianity of the blood myth as well. So I guess my question here for you is that to what extent can we actually look at a single folktale or dispersing and being a distinct entity that kind of enters into a region, or is it really just kind of a bleeding of different cultures together that then manifest in new forms every time?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I understand your question entirely, but so we can talk about this. But the idea was that a story will diffuse from place to place, and it will reflect the local culture. What I've found, for example, when it diffuses into a place like Cornwall, which is dominated not only by mining but by a maritime culture, the famous pirates of Penzance, it was very much dominated by the ocean. That the stories that were often told in other places in Europe or in Britain and dealt with a horse, for example, often ended up with a boat. So the famous Lenore legend, for example, which became the heart of one of the great moments in the early Romantic era movement with a poem, the Lenore poem, features a soldier who died in battle who returns home to get his bride, and in fact wants to take her back to the grave. And she rides on the back of his horse and at night, and just as she arrives near the grave, she realizes that he's in fact dead, and tries to escape, and usually does manage to escape, but the fright of the circumstance causes her to die shortly thereafter, after telling her story so that everyone can repeat the story in the form of a legend. In Cornwall, that often turns into a boat, and he's a sailor who died at sea. Well, we don't have a grave because he died at sea. And the horse, he doesn't have a horse because he's a sailor, so he takes her into a little rowboat and she sails away. That deprives us of her deathbed telling of the incident, so it's frequently told by being witnessed by another person who saw the boat going off into the dark of the night and into a cloud bank, a foggy cloud bank. That so it's adapted as it goes. Another example is that in Northern Europe, we often have what's called social supernatural beings. That is, the elves, the fairies, or the knockers, for that matter, lived in community groups. In the case of the knockers, this means a community of miners devoid of women, because women weren't allowed into the mines in pre-industrial settings. But they thought of them as living in villages, in communities with men and women and children and the whole thing. And for example, they are often accused of stealing children. In this case, those babies were human babies, were stolen and taken into their community, and they were often stolen by the entire family. As it diffuses into a place like Germany, which didn't have social supernatural beings, it's often just a single entity that would steal the babies. So, and so the story survives, but it's affected by the local belief systems and by the local geology and history of the area.
Yeah, I mean, you've answered the question perfectly as far as I'm concerned, because I was trying to get at the idea that a newly introduced idea or newly introduced folktale doesn't enter into a vacuum or a blank slate. That it has to be reinterpreted and reinterpreted and then kind of reproduced in a form that's intelligible and meaningful to the people who are listening to it being reproduced.
Right, absolutely. And it's a process. It is a historical process. I think some folklorists have stepped away from appreciating or wanting to deal with that historical process. And many folklorists, especially in the United States, have tended to look at it as more akin to the ethnographic approach to humanity. That is, you just look at the contemporary environment, you deal with the contemporary environment, you record it, you try to understand it, but you don't necessarily deal with its history. And I don't belong to that school. I'm very much a Europeanist in that regard. And I've always been interested in the historical process of diffusion, change. And then as a historian, because I do wear that hat as well, whenever I deal with historical topics and groups of historical people, I'm always keenly aware that they, like our contemporaries, like every people who ever lived, tell stories, have belief systems that affect those stories, and then that became the coat that they wore as they made it through life. The historical documents don't always directly reflect that belief system and that folklore, but it is possible to tease it out. And that's been, so even when I do history, I try to do folklore, and when I'm a folklorist, I try to do history.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I should guiltily admit that I've been kind of thinking of folklore as an ethnographic process. So I guess I'm guiltily American in that sense of approaching it, because it does seem like if you look at it, not just from place to place and group to group and culture to culture, but if you look at it, a generation or two later, then there's going to be something different. But I guess I'm tying back in that historical approach as well.
Yeah, and you're in good company to look at it ethnographically, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not being critical of that. It's just been my inclination to look at the history of the oral tradition more than just its contemporary setting. So there's nothing good or bad about either approach. It's just that I prefer and am inclined to look at the historical processes and the historical forms. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been active, I suppose, with AskHistorians. It's I can't help myself from being either a historian or a folklorist. I'm just a little bit of both.
Something you've also been talked about is, or that we've kind of been going around, is this idea of some people tell the stories, other people hear the stories, and this is, I think, to go back to von Sydow again, that this dichotomy between active and passive tradition bearers. So, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think that it's pretty obvious. We've known people who can tell jokes and often are obnoxious in that process because they refuse to stop telling jokes. And there are some people who couldn't tell a joke to save their life. And I knew this one woman who was absolutely not a tradition bearer, and to the point where she hated jokes because she couldn't remember them, she couldn't tell them. And so she focused on the cruelty, because jokes are often cruel. And one time I thought, I got a joke for her that she will appreciate, because it's not particularly cruel. And that is, how many surrealists does it take to change a light bulb? Do you know that one?
I believe the answer is a fish.
Yes. The way I heard it was, this is a variant. This is what we would call a variant. So this must be an Eastern variant. I'm from the West, and the answer is frog. Not just a frog, but simply frog, because that makes it even that much more surrealistic. Well, she thought that was the funniest joke she'd ever heard. And it was at a reception when I told her that. She immediately peeled off to go to the other side of the room to tell somebody she knew this joke. And she came back within a minute and said, well, now what was the punchline? she couldn't remember that punchline from that simple joke. She would be a passive bearer of the oral tradition. That is somebody who receives it, but it will never bear it to save her life. And there are some people who are simply very good at repeating stories and have a real mind for it, a memory that allows them to repeat what they've heard once. And there are other people who can't do it. They simply cannot do it. They're the tone deaf of the folklore world.
Now, you wouldn't certain people, even if they don't have a great facility for being an active bearer, at least at some point, particularly if they're kind of removed from their kind of local environment and have to kind of represent that somewhere else where they're kind of in the minority or they're the stranger, wouldn't they kind of de facto slide in from being a passive to an active bearer, simply because they are, by the very nature of their being, are basically a standard of that culture?
Absolutely, and we're all inclined to do that. If something is clearly bad luck from our point of view, and we move to another culture where that's not the issue, and somebody's about to walk under a ladder, we might feel very much inclined to say, you shouldn't walk under that ladder, what are you doing? And explain to that person that in fact that's bad luck. And then you would have this cultural exchange between what is somebody who had become, by virtue of their new environment, an active bearer of their tradition, interacting with somebody else who may not have that as part of their tradition. So yeah, and that would often be the case. And another example of that would be an active bearer who tells a story about where elves came from, and said, well, and this is something where they would integrate the new Christian religion into what was undoubtedly at some point a pre-conversion belief system, and say, well, the elves are the result of one day God came to visit Adam and Eve, and he asked to see Eve's children. And she knew that he was coming, but she only had time to wash some of them. So some of them were, in fact, not clean, and she was embarrassed by that. So she chose not to show the dirty children that hadn't been clean. She neglected to show those to God. And God said to her, that which has been hidden from me will remain hidden from you. And so they became the Hulder folk, the hidden ones, the elves, because they had been hidden from humanity. And then as I would tell you that story, you might respond, well, that's very interesting. But I had heard that, in fact, the elves are the angels who fell from heaven during the great conflict between Lucifer and God. And the really bad ones ended up in hell, and the really good ones ended up in heaven. But the ones who refused to take a side were neither good nor evil, ended up on Earth, and they are the elves. And another person might say, well, that's interesting. I've heard that, but I've also heard this, and it could go on and on with all these rebuttals about, because there were in fact many different stories to explain the origin of elves, that they were maybe ancient people who had lived in the area, and that's what I heard. And so I like to think of them as in fact the ancient people who lived here thousands of years ago and have diminished into these semi-invisible entities who lurk about in the shadows.
Yeah, I'm reminded of kind of a legend, or well, I'm not sure if it fits into the proper etymological term of legend that we're using in this discussion, but in my own layperson idea of a legend of the will-o-wisp, these floating balls of light out in the woods that you'd see and are kind of common and popular in kind of southeastern folklore. And I've heard at least 4 or 5 different versions of what they are. There's spirits of people who've died in the woods. They're a witch luring you in there. It's a man who is so wicked that he was not allowed in hell and was told to go. He was given a coal, a burning coal, and told to go found his own hell. So he wanders around the woods. But, they all typically have kind of a similar idea of saying, don't go in the woods when you see those. This kind of, even though they may have, very disparate ways of explaining them, they all kind of have this unity of purpose, I guess you could say.
You see, you're becoming a folklorist. That is very much a legend, and so you're dangerously close to being a convert. But that's a very good example of just that sort of thing, of multiple explanations. And you might have somebody who's not really a tradition bearer, but can't bear not to say, well, I've heard that this story about that, indeed, which is a European motif. All those are European motifs to explain the will-o-wisp, and they're conflicting. And an active bearer tells one story, and the audience responds. Maybe not active bearers, but they can't resist the opportunity to step in and say, "Oh, but I've heard that it in fact is this." And so you have all these alternate explanations, and they live side by side. In Ask Historians and often in other subreddits, I frequently see people saying, well, what is the explanation for this? Or what is the relationship of this god to that god? And I always think, whatever you say, there would be somebody in that historical environment that you're asking about in ancient Greece or in pre-industrial Britain or in Viking era Norway, who would say, no, that's not the case. I've heard it's this way, because the folk don't have a written Bible that can tell them exactly how the supernatural behaves. They grope around together and try to piece it together, and they often contradict one another.
Yeah, I actually want to segue back to this idea of people who, just can't help but be active bearers of their tradition, and they're kind of, I guess you could say, like inadvertent active tradition bearers, because I want to talk a little about immigration as well, because a lot of your work, we've mostly been talking about Europe, but a lot of your work is also focused in the American West, but still deals with these groups of like Cornish people who immigrated there because of the mining. So do we see these people showing up and kind of being active tradition bearers of these Cornish folktales?
Very much so. It one of the ideas that I've been playing around with, and I've really tried to develop, and will become a cornerstone of the book I'm trying to produce on Cornish folklore, is the adaptation of von Sudhoff's and Lilleblad's idea of oikotypes, which focused on the effect of a story as it diffused geographically, but also to consider how it diffuses historically. With immigration, we have a geographic process, but it's also a historical process. And so the Cornish knackers, who were affected by industrialization in Britain, were then affected again by immigration. Usually supernatural beings other than ghosts did not survive the immigration process very well. So that you might have an active bearer who comes to the New World with a body of folklore and might die a believer, but it's very rare that they're able to communicate that belief system to a next generation or to other people. The odd exception to that is the Cornish knockers, who became the Tommy knockers of the American West, and it became an active tradition that other people held. I was giving a lecture on this about over 10 years ago, and one fellow who was bursting at the seams to become an active bearer said, I actually heard the Tommy knockers once, and he told a story about how he had been drinking heavily and had
always a sign of a great veracity.
Yes, but in this case he in fact did not witness the knockers when he was drunk, but rather he had crawled into a drift in a mine in north central Nevada in the 1950s, and had fallen asleep. And when he woke up, he said he heard the Tommy knockers, and his father had told him about the Tommy knockers, and he was terrified and left. But his father was from Portugal. This was a Portuguese American, so far removed from a Cornish immigrant that you could possibly be. And yet he became an active bearer of a folk tradition that originated with Cornish immigrants. It became an American folklore, a bit of American folklore, which I find fascinating, because that doesn't normally happen. We don't normally end up with true believers who adopted a belief system from other immigrants from other countries.
Now, I want to loop back around to how this idea of the knockers changed in America, but I want to go back to something you said kind of at the start there, which was that we usually don't see supernatural beings, except for ghosts, survive the journey across the Atlantic. I mean, I suppose there's probably many theories as to why, right?
Well, I think in the industrial world, certain types of supernatural beings tend to evaporate with the bright glare of industrial light. Some of them don't. As a modern post-industrial, postmodern society, we have ghosts, we have angels, we have God. Some supernatural beings do very well, don't they? And other supernatural beings, mermaids, elves, those sort of things tend to dissipate. And it's just part of the process. Explaining that would be a challenge. It is a historical process. It is a very real process, but why that happens, I'm not sure.
Now, I suppose there could also be the idea of some of that belief could be siphoned off into believing in new things, because when you're mentioning things like, we have some supernatural beings that, faded away, some have come apart, some that have kind of, maintained. I'm also thinking about the idea of like people who are really into like cryptozoology and, Bigfoot, Sasquatch or alien abductions, things like that kind of play a modern role in a way of replacing the supernatural beings with beings that are not quite so supernatural, but are also still not quite real, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and those would be others that immediately come to mind. That the fact is, just as nature abhors a vacuum, so does humanity and history, and we will not be defied. We will continue to be the folk, even if we're literate and very sophisticated, as we would prefer to think. But we will still populate the world with magic in its own right.
Now, to loop back to what we were talking about earlier, how did we see the actual, because I assume you can trace the changes through various writings and diaries and journals and things like that of people. How did we see the idea of the knockers of Cornwall change into the Tommy knockers of the American West?
Yeah, it's a tough thing. I mean, when you're dealing with the historical resources, you have to go to primary sources that just refuse to answer all your questions. That's the virtue of being a modern folklorist who only works with contemporary societies, because when you're not satisfied with the answer you get, you can always repeat and ask another question. But with primary sources, you get what you got, and so it's a matter of teasing out the insights. It's not easy. It's a maddening detective process with imperfect sources. But given that, I think it's fairly clear that the original knockers did a variety of things for the pre-industrial miners. They warned miners of dangers underground, but they also led miners to valuable ore bodies. So the subtle differences in a tapping that might indicate in one case a imminent collapse and inspire the miners to leave. In another case, might inspire them to start digging in another direction for valuable ore. That motif became less appropriate for an industrial mine, which was owned by by somebody else, a mine owner that would become rich if you found rich ore, and might not do as well if you didn't find rich ore. The miner was a wage earner at that point. He didn't particularly care to be led to rich ore. He only cared to be warned. And so after industrialization, the Tommyknockers begin to be more and more a warning device. With immigration, these new Cornish miners often were their own miners, own mine owners, and so they resumed the idea of knockers, these Tommyknockers, leading them to valuable ore. And again, then with corporate involvement with the Western mines, that drops off, but the warning aspect of the Tommyknockers survives. So we're seeing a historical process affected by industrialization and then affected by immigration and the subsequent corporate involvement of mines in the American West.
You also mentioned something there about the difficulty of using historical sources, and I kind of want to start moving us towards talking about the interplay between the historical method and the folkloric method, I guess you could say. Because, when you're dealing with these, I guess you could say, personal sources or very biased sources or limited sources, I would guess I would turn to you and say, how much can you trust what these people are saying? How do you verify the veracity of this? Because we're really talking about a really kind of an oral tradition being captured at particular parts of time. So, how do you know that these beliefs that you read in one account were widespread, or was it just this one person?
Well, that was the real problem that confronted all the humanities as positivism began to influence how the humanities function. Because when you're dealing with humanity, something that's wrapped up in so many layers of subjectivity, how do you provide a true scientific explanation in an objective way of what was going on? It's a very difficult process. And the Romantic era humanists were dumbfounded with that question and preferred to stay away from it. But somebody like Sven Dillblad, who was influenced by somebody like Boas in the American West, using collection methods that were exact and a scientific laying out of the geography and then looking at these geographic zones, it was very influential in folklore. But what I would say to that is that within any body of literature, there are passive assumptions about the supernatural that become the bedrock of those primary sources. So that if you believe that ghosts are purely a spiritual entity, you're going to see that in a primary source. You're not going to see in the primary source a matter of the corpses getting up and walking around. On the other hand, if you believe that the dead only walk the earth in the form of their bodies, animated corpses, then you're not going to have in the literature, in a primary source, in a letter that somebody wrote to somebody else, a discussion of a ghost in an ethereal form being encountered by somebody. And that is a very real aspect of historical culture that you can hang your hat on. It's not unlike the French Annales school that talked about not so much what really happened in this transition between this king and that king, and did Richard III really murder his nephews. That's not so as important as the shifts in mentality. So to put it in modern terms, we may not agree as historians or as a society as to who shot John Kennedy, but we can agree that a large number of people in American society believed there was a conspiracy. Was there a conspiracy? That's not the answer. That the folklorist doesn't have to answer that question. Did people believe there was a conspiracy? Yes. And so that is something you can hang your hat on, and that's what you zero in on in the primary sources, is what evidence do we have of what people believed.
It's interesting you're talking about these kind of explaining historical events as well, because in my own field of interest, which is in Mesoamerica, particularly the Aztecs, a lot of the sources or histories were written long after the fact. After the conquest, we have history has been written both by Spanish and native people, which are telling historical events that happened 200 or even 300 years before, and a lot of times a lot of kind of supernatural events gets wrapped up in that. So I was kind of wondering, when you encounter these as a folklorist and as a historian, when you encounter these works, these texts, which are ostensibly histories, but they're kind of pre-modern histories in the sense that they don't distinguish between mythology and factual events. How do you go about teasing those out? Do you simply interpret them as reflecting what was important of the people writing at the time, or do you say that they were really trying to attempt to recapture what they knew of the history?
Well, I think a little bit of both, but the focus would be on the writers, not on the past. So if you're a historian committed to understanding the period of conquest, and you go to these primary sources written several hundred years later, you're going to have a maddening task of trying to sort out what is true and what isn't, and understanding, using source criticism, understanding how affected the real incident was when looking through the murky, impure prism that you're forced to look at the past with. The beauty of folklore is that you don't care what really happened. You simply look at what people said happened, and that's good enough.
And so it's more of saying like, well, these things were important to those people, and that's really kind of the takeaway that we're getting here, that this reflects more upon, what the writer says reflects more upon them than upon what really could have happened, and that's kind of a side story then.
Right. I don't care whether George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. Let the historian prove that he didn't. What I care about is that people were so enamored by the figure of George Washington as he traveled through time long after his death, that they ascribed that story to him, and that's what the folklorists focus on. Now, it can be taken to its extreme, as we started out in our discussion. That folklorists could say, I don't want to know about how historical people told this story. I want to know whether anybody here tells that story, and if they didn't, I don't care. I'm going to move on to the stories they do tell. I'm interested in the historical period and in the historical process of what people told. So I'm not interested in George Washington as a historical figure in the 18th century. I'm not interested in talking to a 21st century person to find out what they have to say about George Washington, but I am intrigued by what they were saying about him in 1850.
Well, I think this is going to kind of bring us to an epilogue, and I want to close out with having you talk a little bit more about the interplay between studying history and studying folklore, and particularly, I think we spent a lot of time talking about how history can inform folklore, but how can studying folklore help historians?
Well, I think, that's something I was trying to talk about earlier on, which is that as a historian, I cannot escape the fact that the people I study had their own belief system. There's a primary source from Virginia City, Nevada, where I did a lot of my work. A perfectly disagreeable woman who wrote her account of 10 years in Nevada. And her son, who she was a widow, and she had taken her son with her looking for the fortune of her brother, and wrote a book that was full of vitriol toward all sorts of people, hated Chinese Americans and hated Jews, you name it. She was just a nasty piece of work. At one point, her son had his finger chopped off, and so she took the finger and put it in a jar full of brandy so that her son's finger would not hurt him, and that was the way that that would make sure that he wouldn't feel pain of this phantom finger by having it placed in brandy. A clear expression of folklore. It was a folk practice. It had nothing to do with good medicine by any standard of today, and it was just simply her acting as a very real person navigating her world with her system of beliefs. And there you see folklore enacted in a primary source. If you keep that in mind, that you in some ways help put these people in their past, in another country, a place that is not today. These are not modern people. They are very much people of their own world with their own belief systems. And keeping that in the forefront of my mind, it's always been a valuable way for me to do history. I'm a social cultural historian. I'm not a biographical historian. I'm not a military historian. So it's very much more of a natural thing for me to use folklore in the historical past. But even with a biographical historian, if you really are interested in if you're writing a biography of George Washington, I think it would be important to use a folklorist filter on occasion when going through his letters and ask the question, just what did he believe and how did he view the world so much differently from the way we do, because he was a man of the 18th century with his own belief system.
Well, Ronald James, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us on the Ask Historians podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you. And I appreciate everything that Ask Historians has done to promote all sorts of aspects of the study of humanity in the past.
And as always, thank you for listening. I hope that this podcast has given you a good, solid foundation to kind of understand what folklore is and how it's practiced as an academic profession, so that you can go out and start recognizing, oikotypes in your own life, and telling your own fics to your own children to confuse them, and educate them, and to point them away from your clandestine mining operations. One thing that struck me listening back to this episode is that folklore is very intimate when it comes down to it. We're speaking a lot about people's ordinary daily lives and sometimes even direct accounts, as we have from that one very particularly nasty woman that Ron was talking about in Virginia City. That even as folklore is examining, these widespread tropes throughout a cultural group, at the same time, it's also, as he puts it, it's navigating through the world, and that's done by an individual. So it feels very intimate, particularly if you're kind of more used to thinking about history and historical events in these grand overarching terms. This is individual people trying to get by and doing so with all the idiosyncrasies that being an individual person necessarily brings, but that's all mediated through these larger kind of cultural myths and legends and folktales, which help to order the world for them. So it's this interplay between the larger sphere of the larger culture and an individual themselves. I really found that fascinating from an anthropological standpoint, which is why probably I was pointing more towards this ethnographic view of interpreting folktales that Ron talked about. It also reminded me of one of our more recent episodes on Haitian voodoo, and the fact that in voodoo we have all these spirits who are all around you, but they're also kind of they're like family. You get to know them. They have their own lives. Some of them are industrious. Some of them are lazy. Some of them are drunk. Some of them are mean. Some of them are happy. And when he was talking about particularly about these these collection of spirits that were living in pre-modern Cornwall. It seemed again like this was not some fanciful supernatural ghosty stuff, but it was something that was really much a part of people's lives and that was incorporated into it as something not supernatural so much as it was part of ordinary daily life. And then of course the harsh light of industrialism came and flushed all this away and left us with nothing but Bigfoot. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I certainly did. Coming up in 2 weeks, we will be having a very special episode of the Ask Historians podcast. We will be broadcasting, well, we won't be broadcasting unless we get a radio tower. We will be publishing the audio recording of the Ask Historians panel at the American Historical Association. So if you missed the live stream when it went out, that will be our next episode here, so you can listen to it in its entirety. Until then, I want to again thank our supporters on Patreon. We've come so very far in so short a time that I'm a little caught unexpected. Our next stretch goal, is it even a stretch goal? Our next goal is going to be basically looking into how frequently we can start doing things like giving away a history book that may be happening depending on how our funding goes. The aim is to get it up to about once a month, but as we accumulate funding here, we'll schedule out how frequently we can do that. We'll be raffling it off to supporters of the podcast. So if you're not a supporter, now's a great time to get in and do that as we start looking at our first giveaway. If you're not a supporter of the podcast through Patreon, you can easily be a supporter of the podcast by rating and review us on iTunes. Once you write a review on there, it bumps us back up into the iTunes "you should listen to this" stranger queue. So do that, and so some strangers can that you don't know, or maybe some people you do know, can listen to the podcast, and then you could talk about folklore with them, and maybe even talk about Stephen King's novel "The Tommyknockers," which is, I think, pretty widely regarded as not his greatest. But I digress. So please rate and review us on iTunes. Go ahead and rate and review us anywhere else you listen to podcasts. And until then, come by the Ask Historians subreddit and ask some questions to our guest. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.